Good afternoon. My name's Daniel Wood. I'm a Chief Remote Pilot and Lead Consultant of Working Drones Australia, based here in Canberra. This presentation is just a short presentation to go over the role of drones in the search for Corey O'Connell, as well as to discuss some of the other emerging technologies and new technologies that we can leverage in future. This slide deck was a presentation done to the SES here in Canberra. But I'll try and sort of break it apart and distill it so that I explain each of the key payloads and options we went through. I guess the agenda is really the introduction and biography, how I got started in drones, and then really just delving straight into finding Corey O'Connell. So without that, so a little bit about my background. Really three verticals: criminology, cybersecurity, and drones. Criminology is really about looking for the underlying causes of crime, patterns and factors of deviant behaviour, and methods to either reduce it, remedy it, or detect it. Cybersecurity is really about protecting users from digital attacks, cyber criminals, and the like. And the story into drones was really an expansion of those two. It really came about from missing persons, so using criminology and cybersecurity techniques to get to the last digital location of a person. And I was getting quite frustrated by the fact that that's really where, my sleuthing sort of ended. So looking into drones and drone technology to really close that last sort of mile from technology to the real environment world. And then I quickly learned the price of some of the technology I was investigating, and really then just had to make a decision as to how to commercialize it, because a lot of the technology wasn't able to be really self-funded. My background, I've got a BA in criminology, obviously a bachelor in cybersecurity. I'm an independent registered assessor for ASD with 20 years in tech and security. And obviously conducted quite a number of missing persons searches. Before I go too far into this is quite a technical presentation. So I wanted to really just pause and I guess acknowledge that we're here because of Corey and Corey's family, in particular Hayley, sort of bringing the community together. So this is quite a technical chat. And we can often lose sight of the fact that behind all of this information and sort of search technique, etc., is a missing person. So I thought I'd just bring that up. Like I mentioned, this was really brought about by contact with Hayley in December of 2022. Hayley, like all good introductions, it was made via social media. Hayley made a post in a drones group that I was following, really looking for something quite advanced. So something that I was familiar with, in particular because of missing person searches. And what really struck me was for somebody not in this industry to really understand what this technology was, whether she meant to or not. It really sort of sparked my curiosity, and she was after sort of hyperspectral imaging, which is something that I've done a lot of research in the past on. With regards to technologies and payloads are basically everything that hangs underneath a drone. The drone itself, funnily enough, we don't particularly care what's carrying the payload. Most of the value and most of the data comes from the payload itself, not so much the drone. So the technologies and payloads can really be split by, I guess, the concept of recent missing, so persons that have just departed their house or in the few days post missing, and then the search for long-term missing. And so recent missing is more about things that you do in real time. You might be flying a drone with thermal, looking for somebody who's lost in the bush, for example. Whereas long-term missing, you're looking for generally static objects, could be clothing, could be the person themselves, could be vehicles, etc. So you're doing a lot of post-processing to really filter out a significant amount of detail in order to get what you're after. So recent missing technologies, like I said, is more focused around things like thermal cameras, producing video or just regular imaging of the areas. And some of the new approaches are also things like IMSI captures. So an IMSI capture can collect the IMSI number or the IMSI number of a mobile telephone and allow searchers to coordinate and direct um, sort of search effort in a particular direction. Now, obviously, an IMSI capture, the phone needs to be on. So it's something you'd be looking at in the first 24 to 48 hours. Long-term missing, again, post-processing is pretty much the key here. Hyperspectral imaging, multispectral, bathymetry, LiDAR, mapping and survey cameras, which is sort of the photogrammetry, and some of the new and emerging technologies, synthetic aperture radar, and then GPS denied technologies. So that's really technologies that can operate without GPS. So in mine shafts, underground, sewers, drains, and the like. So thermal imagery, I'm sure everyone's familiar with thermal imagery. One of the things that's sort of important as we go through this is to understand really how imagery comes about. And how cameras work, I guess, is probably the main thing. So a standard camera, when you take a photo and you get, the bright scene that you're used to, that's capturing different spectrums of light in order to create that visible view of the photo. With thermal, it's filtering out certain elements as well as capturing other types of light, in this case near infrared, and you can see the koala in this photo at the top right and indeed in the center. Now, why this is important is because when we start to get into things like multispectral, it's quite similar to thermal. So instead of seeing thermal, which pretty much everyone understands what thermal looks like, it's actually detecting other characteristics or other spectrums of light. So not near infrared, but indeed other spectrums. And so as we start to get into things like hyperspectral, you can see in this image, this is a paddock. So if I was to show you the actual um, normal photo of this, you wouldn't really be able to tell the difference. But you can see in this image, there's a whole bunch of different squares, and that's really where something has been applied to it. So it's either a fertilizer to boost productivity in the paddock, and again, this is just a test site, or something like a weed killer to look at the effects on the native grasses of something like a herbicide. In the case of using hyperspectral and multispectral for missing persons, what you're really looking at is what impact has the missing person's their body had on the environment. So if that person was in a paddock like this, you would generally see a rough outline of human sized. Um, of that body, or indeed if it was foul play or somebody potentially buried them, you would see a change in the subsurface soil, and indeed you'd see it reflected in discoloration, much like you see here. Now, hyperspectral is really good for cleared areas, and you can see in this image it's quite clear. However, if somebody was in a forested area, the penetration of light, or that light spectrum, like we spoke about with thermal, is diffused by the tree canopy. So it doesn't work particularly well in forested areas, as well as there's a lot of natural sort of degradation of forestry material in forests, the leaf matter decay. There's other animals, other bird droppings, etc. And so that really interferes with the ability to use hyperspectral in forested areas. I guess one thing to note is you would still see it in terms of whatever it is you're looking for. You would still see it represented in the data, but there's just so much data and so much noise. It's a case of you wouldn't see the forest for the trees. It's just indistinguishable. The next area of technology, which we use quite a lot of, is bathymetry. And bathymetry is really an echo sounder underneath a drone, and I'll show you a little bit of a video of that. So you can see here in the center of the screen is a drone with an echo sounder underneath it. And it'll fly a coordinated mission, and it'll basically place the echo sounder in the water, and it's able to get a depth reading. Now, if we're looking for things such as submerged vehicles, etc., this is a really good way of seeing the sort of the height of the vehicle. I'll show you another one, which is a little bit clearer. So you can see here, it's dipping the echo sounder in and lifting it out. We can also tow the echo sounder. So if you've got quite a small area, you may want to sort of tow it instead of doing what's shown here. And that gives you the depth of the water. And again, if there's something like a vehicle that it goes over, then you'll see that sudden rise or change in the depth. You wouldn't see a person with bathymetry, much in the same way you generally wouldn't see a person with LiDAR. We're starting to get into sort of machine learning with LiDAR in order to classify and explore methods of finding person-sized objects with LiDAR. But we've got a ways to go. We're fairly certain we can do vehicles and sort of planar surfaces that are flat, or that are sort of probably more or better described as not natural-like. So in a forest, for example, you're unlikely to get flat surfaces of that nature, or curved surfaces like the roof of a car, for example. Um, so LiDAR technology is very interesting in searching for missing persons. It's probably best applied to things like motor vehicles. Again, very difficult to find a person. It will, much like hyperspectral, you will see the person. If you knew they were there after the fact, you would be able to sort of recreate it. But the biggest issue is you end up with so much data that finding that piece of data is near impossible. So I'll show you some data now. One of the things to understand with LiDAR is that it's basically, and the way I describe it is like a disco ball on steroids. It shoots out, in this case, 640,000 pulses of light per second. And those pulses will hit an object and come back to the LiDAR unit. And it's able to then gauge the distance from all objects. And you can see in the right here, this is a truck. And you can see by the shape of the truck, you can see the ground here. If we have a look at some cars over here, you can see that the LiDAR unit has shot a laser out, it's hit the roof of the vehicle, and it's come back to the LiDAR unit. And that's how it knows that there's this separation between each of the objects. Now, some of the bigger benefits of LiDAR is its ability to penetrate trees and tree canopy. So if we go over to some trees here, you can see the trees. See if I've even done it here. And then we do what's called ground classification in order to remove the trees. And so you're left with just the raw ground. It's a little bit noisy here. I just make the points a bit bigger. So you can see the ground. Now, why this is important is because if you've got a car or something else, or like a house in a forest, no matter what you do, you're not going to be able to shoot light through the roof of that building, for example. So when you do ground classification, you'll end up with a square of data that no laser beams has hit. So when we're looking for vehicles in heavy forest, we're not really looking for the vehicle per se. What we're looking for is basically a vehicle-sized hole in our ground layer. And that means we can then sort of inspect it further. Other things we do as well is, let me just make this a little bit smaller, it's silly. Other things we do is filtering based on intensity. And again, much like, and this is, you can see here, there's a car-sized hole, or in this case, a truck-sized hole in the data. And that's what we're really looking for. The other thing, much like thermal and we spoke about hyperspectral with, you'll see that that data, but there's just so much data you can't really filter it or search large areas. LiDAR, in a way, has given us some techniques, and each of these points has a set of information. Let me just quickly pull one up. I'll just click on a random point. A little difficult to see, but it gives you things like how high the drone was, what's the color of that individual point, how much intensity when it was reflected back from that surface. Did the LiDAR unit, because it's light, what was the intensity level when it came back? And that allows us to think of things like, forested areas or vegetated areas typically absorb a lot of light, whereas metallic objects like cars, for example, will reflect a lot of light, and the intensity is generally higher from those types of objects. So if I switch to like an intensity filter, you start getting things happen like the ground disappearing. And you might say, well, why do we care about that? Well, the biggest reason we care about the ground disappearing is because we're no longer looking at all those points. We just have the truck basically pulled out of that data set because of that type of filtering. And that's really what we're exploring now in AI and machine learning when doing these vast surveys. Obviously, this is a truck sitting in the middle of a car park. It's not exactly difficult to see, but we're starting to work on things like the angle of the roof, like I said, the intensity of the returns, and trying to classify and pull information out of large search areas. And then we can obviously, with the LiDAR units themselves, if we're sort of uncertain of anything, we can also click on it and pull up really the photo as well. So you're able to see the actual photo that the LiDAR unit took as it flew over. So it's something very handy for missing persons. The next thing to talk about is photogrammetry. Now, I guess it's probably worthwhile talking about Corey and where Corey went missing, and why did we select photogrammetry. So I've kind of been alluding to it as we've gone along. We've looked at LiDAR, which is the most recent one, which is particularly challenging to look for persons in forest. If Corey was missing with a vehicle, that would be a possibility, or if Corey was potentially hiding out in a building, there's the opportunity to find that. Another thing LiDAR is good for is searching an area and looking for where there's deviations in the Earth's surface, so potentially holes that someone may have fallen into, or a mine shaft, for example. Obviously, we looked at bathymetry. There's no particular water bodies where Corey went missing. And then the multi and hyperspectral. So Corey was missing in a forested area, and that really ruled out the use of technology such as hyper and multispectral and the ability to process that volume of data. So then we really went down to, well, we need to do high resolution imagery in order to just really to blanket the search area to give us the best chance of seeing Corey. And that's what we did. With all things photogrammetry and pretty much all missions, the planning is key. And so I'll show you quickly. So this is NANUP, and these searches that are loading are the searches we did. All in all, there was 22 mission areas. Each area consisted of at least one, but generally 2 or 3 flights. And obviously each flight requires a change of batteries, etc. This is something we did over the course of 4 days. So if I zoom in, you can see just the level of complexity of some of these shapes. And each of them are named. And all these pins are really the takeoff and landing locations. So quite a big effort. So the next thing I wanted to talk to you about was taking photos in general. Um, most people probably aren't aware. I'll just pull up an actual image. Most people probably aren't aware of what actually happens when you're taking an aerial photo. So most lenses are round, and what happens is called parallax error, where objects in the image will lean away from the center of the lens. And so I'll just give you an example. So in the right-hand side, you can see the base of the tree. Let's just pick this one, for example. The base of the tree is here where my cursor is, and you can see that it's leaning to the right. So if somebody was behind this tree, we wouldn't see them. So if we go to the other side of the image, you can see here, I've got my cursor on the base of the tree here, and it's leaning to the left. And so you've got, and that happens pretty much all around the image. I won't show you every corner, but you can see on the right-hand side it's leaning one way, and on the left-hand side it's leaning the other. And so the challenge is, what happens if what we're looking for is behind those trees? So we actually want to keep taking photos. So if we go behind this side, for example, then the tree will lean the other way. And in a way, we construct the mission such that we're flying on pretty much all sides of objects so that the trees will lean away from the lens per se, such that we can get a clear view of the ground. And that gives us our greatest chance of seeing everything in the forest. And that just requires a significant amount of overlap. Show you here. So if we're wanting to look sort of behind trees, I mean, we can't see through trees, then we introduce a significant amount of overlap. The other reason we use a lot of overlap is if you want to stitch it together. And stitching things together is what's called orthorectification. And it's really what Google Earth does. So if you went to a Google Earth map of a forest, coincidentally, I have one right here, you'll notice that none of the trees, I mean, it's a pretty terrible image, but none of the trees actually do what I said because it's been fixed, really. So all the in the algorithm, it's said, well, we're all going this way in this section of the image. And in some other parts, it might change to be a different direction. But that's basically called orthorectification. Now, when we were considering how is somebody going to go through all of these images, what we were thinking initially is we can potentially take photos of the whole area, and this is just one area, for example, and there's about 4,000 images here, and then stitch them together. And so you get a Google Earth-like image, and then we could chop it up into sort of 100-meter sections. But we really wanted to have that parallax error. So we didn't want to work that error out by doing an orthomosaic and then cutting it up into 100-meter sections, because it was that overlap, that parallax error, that was allowing us to see sort of both sides of trees and allowing that really granular search. What it meant was there was 45,000 images to go through instead of something that was either one entire stitched image or maybe 500 images. So we had to make a decision as to, well, if we're going to go down this route, who's going to go through 45,000 images? Because it was quite an undertaking. And so myself and Jeremy, one of the guys who works for me, was sitting in Brisbane Airport, one of the airports, pretty much shortly after we'd done this. So I'd already thought about the whole issue with parallax, and so I'd already captured the data in order to best have a chance of finding Corey. And we sat down and basically worked out, well, we need to build a website that supports this very manual method of looking. And this is really where I got a lot of faith in Hayley and Hayley's community that she built up in looking for Corey, because I knew we had the members there in order to get through that volume of images. Because, like I said, there's 45,000. And Hayley, I'm not sure the total number of the community, but there were certainly thousands of people willing to look. So we built the AIRS website. AIRS stands for the Aerial Information Review Service. We use it a lot in our commercial practices as well as for the purposes of missing persons. So the Corey's data is no longer there. However, I do have another set of data that I'm hosting, which is Wayne Parker's information. So each of the mission areas, you typically have a sort of a placeholder for the area searched. But when you click on that area, you're basically presented with all the images that were captured in this area. In the case of Corey, each of these areas were up to 3,500 photos, so a significant number of photos. Each of the images can be clicked on and gone through, and you'll note in the right-hand side there's a series of buttons. We've got interesting or not interesting. So if somebody was to zoom in and find something interesting, they're able to flag it, and we would get notified that there was something interesting in that photo and be able to review it and look at it. And this has full search sort of zoom capabilities, and you're able to just scroll through, and you're able to do this on any device. Another area of this that we built that was pretty important to us was the random images function. So I'll just go back. So random images, probably should find a better name for it. It's not really random images. It is 20 of the least viewed images. So in the case of Corey, we knew we had 22 search areas, up to 3,500 images per search area. And it's going to be a pretty dedicated person who gets to area 22, image 3,500 without going crazy. So what we wanted to do was serve up images that hadn't been viewed or viewed the least. And so in the random images location, and this was actually the function that the person who ended up detecting Corey O'Connell used in order to do that. So people were going to random images, and they were able to see, and you can see here there's image 313 and image 136 and 294, for example. These images have been viewed the least. And out of those, 10 or so areas, these will all be pulled from different areas. And you can see just by the nature of the color and the roads and etc. So this is a very critical part of the website. We're finalising some development for the website, which will also include things like the ability to pinpoint exact locations and give more specific information about the image, because it's very tedious when you get a report trying to find where they mean and then look at it and, anyway, but there's further improvements coming. Let me go back to my slides, going off on a bit of a tangent. So, yeah, okay. So the AIRS website obviously played a critical role in finding Corey O'Connell. We conducted the searches in approximately, don't really know, let's say May. And within a few months, we'd built the website and hosted the data. There was nearly a terabyte of images that we'd hosted. That's 45,000 images. And then I don't know the exact timeline, but I think within 24 hours, we were notified that something had been seen or detected, and that person came forward to us. And through our technology, we were able to basically pinpoint within about 30 millimeters of that exact location on Earth, really, due to the degree of gear we were using for the search. Then the police were able to basically go straight there, and sort of everyone else knows the story from there. Part of the story, I guess, look, I'm going to skip over the actual image. I don't think it's necessary. But part of the AIRS journey, I guess, is also using some of our commercial image analysis software to try and detect things that sort of don't belong there, aren't forest, for example. And I'll just give you a quick look at this video. So this is our software looking at weeds. So it looks at all the tussocks, identifies different characteristics of a particular weed. In this case, it's silverleaf nightshade. And the orange color is really its level of confidence. So as it continues to process and gets towards the end of this timeline, it's reviewed and assessed every single thing here. And the intensity of the orange is the level of confidence that this is the weed we're looking for. And so what we're looking to do in the future, and this was the intent certainly with Corey, was to bring machine learning on board for the image analysis as well. I'll just pause that there. And so the intent is to reduce or at least prioritize some images that are selected by machine learning and AI as higher likelihood of containing either human remains or things that don't belong there, whether it's household furniture that's potentially been dumped, whether it's vehicles, indeed persons, and really flag those so that we can prioritize them in our searches. So look, that was a brief chat about sort of the search for Corey O'Connell. My details are here. Again, I'm the Chief Remote Pilot and owner of Working Drones Australia. Feel free to email me with any questions. Thank you.